So today we're going to be hearing from Martin Blakey about the Renters Reform Bill. Martin is Chief Executive at Unipol, and he's going to be giving some thoughts on the bill, what it might mean for the student housing sector, some of the lobbying that's been going on, and the latest that we know from the government. After that, we have about 20 to 25 minutes for questions and discussion, and we should be finished by 12 noon. So I'm going to hand over to Martin.
Okay, thanks very much, Victoria, and welcome everybody. Many years ago, we used to do quite a bit of complex legal training with Hilary Crook, and she always started off the most complicated module by saying, you're here because you want to know what's going on. But the big gain today may be that you know that nobody else knows what's going on. And I have that kind of feeling as I go through stuff. So here's the big moment when we try and share the screen. And hope that that works. Okay. Is that working? Can you see the whole slide?
Yeah, just start slide, sure.
Yeah, okay, right. Okay, so let's make a start because there's a bit to get through. We said in the blurb that we'd look at those three things: where the bill's up to and what's its likely timetable, what's happening to student exemptions from security of tenure. That's about what I'm going to call off-street housing, small houses, not PBSA, purpose-built student accommodation. And then just which bits of the bill are definitely going to happen and what implications are there for PBSA and off-street landlords. I think quite a lot of PBSA suppliers have perhaps convinced themselves that this single issue of tenure is kind of, that if they're going to be exempt from that, they're exempt from everything else, but they won't be. Just on timing, this was the bill was tabled in Parliament on 17th of May. And despite promises from Michael Gove that it would become law before Christmas, it wasn't timetabled in the end of the parliamentary session. And so it's fairly unlikely, actually, that it's going to be resolved, this bill, within this Parliament. So if I was guessing, and everybody is, we never quite know what the government can do, but it's unlikely they're going to speed this up. The second implementation date, as it was known, is now unlikely to happen before autumn 25. So I think if you were looking at, if all this passed as it was today, when might it come into action? You'd be looking in student terms at the 25-26 academic year. Some of you will have spotted that there's an election in between there. So your guess is as good as mine in terms of what happens to the bill when it becomes an act. So just to update you on a few things, there was an impact assessment by the Regulatory Policy Committee published on the 5th of July. These are often fairly uninteresting documents, but this one has a couple of interesting things in it. So whilst it gave a green fit for purpose rating to the overall bill, and I've given you the link there, we'll circulate this later so you can find all this and read it for yourself if you want. It did describe a few elements of the bill as weak or very weak in terms of the impact assessment. And the quote was, the impact assessment draws upon various evidence sources, in particular the latest findings from the English Household Survey, to inform the analysis. Whilst the analysis of the direct impacts is sufficient, the impact assessment lacks a suitable quantitative analysis of the potential very substantial broader impact on landlords and the private rented sector market due to the reforms, and it should have better considered the specific quantitative impacts faced by most affected landlords rather than focusing primarily on average impacts across the whole private rented sector. So that's of relevance to us, because what the government could say is, well, if property moves from students to non-students or from non-students to students, that really has no impact on the size of the private rented sector. But of course, within those subsectors, it has a very, very significant impact. So that's what that is identifying. And on the 10th of July, Sir Christopher Choke, in oral questions to Michael Gove, raised that specifically and said, what were you going to do about it? what did you think of the assessment? And Michael Gove said, I've read it and it seems fantastic. I've spared you what Sir Christopher Chope said next, but what he said is, could you move on from your facile response and answer my question? But you can read all that if you want. And then he said, I was very pleased that the impact assessment gave the bill a green rating, and I was particularly pleased that it indicated the likely additional cost would be £17 a year for landlords, that he's talking about, and that the benefits would be significantly greater than that. I think if we carried out an economic assessment of how much it might cost within the student sector, I think it's unlikely we'd get that down to £17 a year. So, you know, I don't know where that really comes from, but a little bit of a push off in terms of their overall approach. So it's worth you putting that into the vault and thinking about it a bit later on. Assured short-haul tenancies will cease to exist, and purpose-built private sector will be exempt from the replacement, which is assured tenancies. So tenure changes will need to be made to assured short-holes, and I can tell you how that's going to happen a bit later on. But lettings from PBSA landlords will still be governed by the Protection from Eviction Act, as indeed are all tenancies. So now let's go to the thorny issue of off-street housing. So in theory, what happens is that tenancies become monthly periodic tenancies. And it won't be possible at the moment to create a fixed term assured tenancy. And a tenant wishing to terminate a tenancy could give 2 months notice. So that's what you'll have been hearing about in terms of the impact that students could come and go at will. And the aim of that is to provide greater security for tenants and will enable tenants to leave poor quality properties without remaining liable for the rent. So that's the rationale behind it. Now, you will know that landlords operating in the student lets market have raised concerns about ending fixed term tenancies. And in January, a coalition of bodies, which included Unipol, but also lots of other sector bodies, wrote to the Minister for Private Housing and Higher Education, saying the reform threatened to make it harder for students to enter higher education. And that was followed by the relevant committee that mirrors DLUC, who also expressed concerns about the effect of the reforms on the general student private rented market. And they concluded in their report that abolishing fixed term contracts here could make letting to students considerably less attractive to private landlords, as the student market mirrors the academic year and benefits from 12-month fixed tenancies. And they recommended the retention of fixed term contracts in the student private sector. And the chair of that committee returned to that issue at a hearing on the 10th of October. And that's where the Minister for State for Housing and Planning, Rachel McLean, who's dealing with this bill, I should just say there was a change of minister just before that. So it was a previous minister, thereby racking up the 15th minister that's been responsible for this area since the Cameron government came in. And she said, the last thing we want to do is to have a negative impact on them, referring to student landlords, because they're a very important part of the offer, referring to the educational offer. So that was what she said at that moment. There was an all-party political group, APPG, on students, held a meeting on the 5th of July, chaired by Paul Blomfield, who's MP for Sheffield Central. So a lot of students in his constituency, well attended by MP students, Generation Rent. Clive Betts was also there, who's the chair of the relevant committee. And the overall outcome was that student renters' rights in the private sector needed improvement, but the current proposals just to treat them the same was likely to cause as many problems as it solved. But there was the point that if students were moved out of the scope of security provisions, then other measures to improve student rights would be important. So there's a real balance to be struck there. And that was really Clive Betts' main contribution, to say we needed to look at how that balance would work. Quite recently, on the 7th of July, the Unipol, Cubo, ASRA and UUK all wrote in the same week to Robert Halfon and Rachel McLean on behalf of the educational sector, raising concerns about the proposals as they stood. And I know this is a long quote, but let's go through it because you'll see the argument developing a bit. We said the letting cycle must be able to reflect the annual academic cycle, and a known endpoint to a tenancy is essential to the student rental market, ensuring that rooms become available in a predictable way so that students can house hunt while they're still in their place of study. So that followed, and that follows on from the next thing, which is, although DLUHC says that, quote, most students will continue to move in line with the academic year, under their proposals, landlords will not know what can be rented until 2 months' notice were given. And that will result in parts of shared housing becoming available to rent over the summer, not necessarily even a whole house. And students need to make their housing arrangements well before that time when they're present in their place of study. So in reality, most students would be unlikely to give 2 months' notice until you get to kind of March or April. Let's just say that everyone says, oh, well, I don't need to rent my house for the final month, so I'll give that in April and I'll leave at the beginning of June. That in itself would be a bit disruptive, but in reality, rents would rise to price that in, because really these are annual lets, because you can't let them in between lets. But that would be priced in, that would be a market adjustment. That itself isn't particularly tragic, inconvenient, but not tragic. The real problem would be that you wouldn't be able to really advertise that property until the end of June. Now, there are lots of suggestions that students could do deals with each other. You know, so a landlord could say to a student, well, if you'd like this property in July, what you could do is go and talk to the students in the house and arrange between you that they will give notice so that you can have it in July. And what fun that would be. All you've got to do is multiply that kind of difficult informal negotiation by just over 500,000 students and everything will work fine. So that is a concern. The other concern is that the supply of shared student off-street housing is already in decline, as the general housing shortage is seeing accommodation move from students to professional renters, owner occupation and tourist accommodation, that's Airbnb stuff. And as a form of affordable housing, off-street housing is increasingly in demand from other renters, but supply is constrained in most cities by Article 4 planning directives. In other words, there's no more shared housing. It's a fairly static supply. So there were the three arguments really that we really majored on. Disruption to the letting cycle, moving outside of the annual academic cycle, uncertainty as to when you could actually advertise properties for being there, and against a background where we're seeing a contraction of accommodation anyway. And we did say it's no good treating students if they have the same needs and requirements as non-students. They're living and renting in a very particular way because of where they study. We did point out, though, that we have been discussing this, as Victoria hinted at the beginning. We've actually been discussing this with the government since 2018, when they first started talking about 3-year tenancies, and then they moved on to indefinite tenancies, and then they moved on to the Renters Reform Act. So this issue's been discussed with DLUHC for at least 5 years. And we think this is a bit of a protracted period of uncertainty, and it's coming, it could come to an end because it's really causing quite a bit of disruption in the market. It's certainly freezing investment, and that is resulting in some falling standards. And it will continue to freeze investment until it's made absolutely clear what the government position is. Robert Halfon replied, he's the Minister for Skills, Apprenticeships and Higher Education, saying the government continues to consider feedback from housing and educational organisations during the bill's progress, and has recognised that there are issues particularly to the student accommodation market. For example, we are considering whether a ground for possession that enables landlords to guarantee vacant possession for next year's tenants may be beneficial for both parties, therefore maintaining the yearly cycle of letting. So that's addressing the yearly cycle of lettings issue, apart from they've been considering those grounds for at least a couple of years. So it would be nice to see the fine print of that, to see whether it would actually work. He also said officials at DLUC will continue to explore this and other issues with the people who wrote to him. And, you know, they hope that we will continue to offer our advice and market expertise. So apart from the slightly creepy ending, we thought that was a little bit of a step forward. We sent a similar letter to Rachel McLean, who responded a few days ago on the 31st of July. And her response is a little bit different. I mean, it's a little bit less creepy. So she's not as grateful as Robert Halford for all of our expertise and thoughts. So she says, as you're aware, purpose-built student accommodation will be exempted. There are key distinctions between standard PRS housing and PBSA, which warrant a different approach. So she's picked up that issue, although it's not an issue we raised. Expanding the exemption for purpose-built to other typical private rented properties let to students would also increase complexity in the system. Creating an imbalance in regulation between private rented properties let to different types of tenants could also lead to an unintended incentive for landlords to let to students instead of to families or other groups. So it's a kind of half a valid point that if you said, well, students are entirely outside of this act, then that would create an imbalance in regulation. But that's actually, to be fair, not what we're saying. And we're also suggesting if you took students out of tenure, out of security of tenure, then you would put in other rights which would stop that happening. I think the notion that landlords would suddenly convert their family houses to shared student housing is a nonsense, because it's not allowed under the planning regulations in almost all major cities following Article 4 direction. And actually, I think it is extremely unlikely that you would get housing moving about, especially larger HMOs, between different tenant groups, because in a way, they have a fairly fixed use to student renting. So I think that just shows a little bit of misunderstanding about how those different markets interact with each other. The properties that would leave the student market are not the 8, 9, 10 bed HMOs. The properties that would leave the student market, if people found that too difficult, would be the 3s, 4s and 5s. They'd be the houses that had a bit more flexibility. But I thought that there were a couple of other interesting things in that. So it's interesting that DLUC doesn't want to increase complexity. We're going to discuss pets in a minute, and you'll see there's quite a lot of complexity when it comes to it. So I think you will find that tenure reform, when they get into the fine print of the bill and when it starts really being examined, you know, it's unavoidable. So I think the let's keep everything simple is a bit of a fallacious argument, frankly. She went on to say student tenants living in typical private rented housing will move from usually fixed term or short hold tenancies to periodic tenancies, which will provide them with the same flexibility as other tenants living in the PRS. Locking tenants into fixed terms would mean they're unable to leave a poor quality property, as other tenants will be able to do in the new system. And we said in reality, we thought that was unlikely. It's an interesting notion, isn't it, that you take, you know, the Fire Safety Act and all the regulations we've seen and licensing, and then it comes down to, well, if tenants are living in a dump, they should leave it. You know, it's a particularly thin argument in terms of housing standards. And to be honest, if you're in an area with a housing shortage, it's also misguided. But she did say, we recognise the concerns of the private rented landlords, sector landlords who specifically let to students and who are keen for us to go further. And then she mirrors what Robert Halford said, which is we're considering solutions such as weathering grounds for possession that enables landlords to guarantee vacant possession for next year's tenants and maintain the yearly cycling of letting, may be beneficial for both parties. Right, so, you know, these two ministers have compared notes. DLUC is the leading department. But they have been saying this for a long while in one way or another, and we haven't seen how they're actually planning to do it or what that suggestion actually amounts to. So, as we mentioned, important aspects to those responses are there's some acknowledgement that students are a specific sector with specific needs, not just PBSA. Their earlier reference to their place in the overall PRS is important, but what they're saying is we don't want to create an imbalance in regulation. So that fits in with the impact assessment of looking at the whole sector rather than looking at impact on bits and pieces of the sector, which I think they're trying to avoid. And they are trying to keep things simple, but anyone involved in housing legislation knows that that won't be how it all works when you get there. But the real problem we've got is that little detailed work has been done on policy options. And with the government saying they acknowledge problems, but we haven't really seen them do any work to map out solutions. And I'm not totally convinced they realise the impact of their own proposals, not whether you're for them or against them, but in fact, what are the actual proposals when you get down to the fine granular details? And I just wanted to give you an example of that. So let's look at rent payment periods, which is in the bill. And section 1, subsection 3 of the Renters Reform Bill says, terms of an assured tenancy which provide for the periods for which rent is payable are of no effect if they provide for any rent period to exceed 28 days and do so otherwise than providing for monthly rent periods. So what that says is that everyone's going to pay rent monthly, or does it? Right? So in the student sector, how does that suite in with student loans and with how students receive their income? And how would that suite in with guarantors? And the theory behind this is that if you have an assured tenancy and you've got a 2-month notice period and the assured tenancy is effectively a 28-day understanding, what that means is that it's difficult to contract rent payments outside of the tenancy. And legally, what happens is that there's a 1-month tenancy, and then there's another 1-month tenancy, and then there's another 1-month tenancy. So forward rent payments become quite problematic. And I've just given you an example there that if rent was calculated by reference to a period longer than 28 days, then the tenancy would be treated as if it was a monthly tenancy. So a tenancy agreement stating that the rent is $12,000 a year payable quarterly wouldn't be acceptable. But an agreement that if it was $12,000 a year paid monthly, would that be fine? And I'm saying maybe, but there isn't a straight answer to that. And by the way, landlords can't contract out of that. So you can't say this is agreed within the contract. So people are going to pay me 3 months in advance or whatever. And there's a subsection that provides for that. So that would have really significant implications for student rent payments, for the current use of guarantors, and for how students pay. So just to give you an example, if students were paying rent over the summer period, before they got their loans at the end of September, they would still be required to pay rent monthly, whereas actually quite a lot of landlords will have a single payment when people's loan payment comes in. But there's no clarity on what that actually means. What I have got is a 4-page document from 2 sets of solicitors interpreting that in very different ways and saying how complicated it could be. And that actually they're not convinced that DLUC have really understood the legal implications of having a rolling assured tenancy. So just an example of where a bit of granular detail and real work is required. So I think our problem is because of the lack of detail, it's really difficult to know what the DLUC offer actually is and how it will operate. And I think I should be very specific in terms of Unipol's involvement and the educational sector's involvement here. So we're not arguing that students should in some way not have security of tenure to benefit landlords. We're arguing fairly strongly that we think it will benefit students. right? So linking us in with a landlord lobby, although we're saying the same things, it can be a bit misleading. So this is what we have suggested, and we've suggested this several times, and one day DLUT will start taking some notice. So the first thing is unintended consequences, and we saw those words being used by Rachel McLean. You know, if we do certain things, there may be unintended consequences. Well, they're not that unintended. So, you know, actually some of them could be addressed. So just in terms of, you know, if we said students were going to be taken out of scope for security of tenure, our suggestions were part-time students would not be taken out of scope. Most part-time students live locally. We proposed only shared student housing should be taken out of scope. Not good news, by the way, for students who were looking for couple properties, because they'll be in the general housing market. But there you are, but you could just restrict that to shared student housing. And then what happens if, how would you do that? Well, all the occupants would be students or intending to be students at the time of signing a tenancy. What about the single parent who has security of tenure, who then starts a course? Would they lose their rights? And the answer is no, they wouldn't, because if you held security before being a student, you could retain those rights. And that's unbelievably easy to do legally. And then, well, what happens if there are students and non-students in the same house? Does this mean they would have different rights? And what we've suggested is mixed non-student and student shared housing would remain within scope of the tenure changes. So they would have security. And by the way, you know, if you look at how council tax works, there's quite a reasonable set of structures already for working out what are mixed houses. So there's no problem about that legally. The other thing is, you'd have to be a full-time student at a approved institution as listed under the Local Government Finance Act. So you couldn't have, you know, a daft landlord setting up their own language school, enrolling their own tenants, and then claiming they were exempt. And then just to return to, if students could give 2 months' notice, that would in some way give students clout in improving housing standards. The problem here is that actually most shared student housing is licensed, about 80%. So local authorities already have a legal duty to ensure that standards are met. So to be honest, we weren't totally convinced that the idea of a student giving 2 months' notice and having to find somewhere else to live at key times in their academic year really holds water as an argument. But it's interesting that if you really wanted to push that argument forward, you could say, well, we think that linking exemption for tenure could be linked to standards in off-street properties. So you could say, let's just exclude licensed properties because they are already regulated. Now, that's not quite what we're saying, but, you know, you might settle for that. And then the other side was to say, well, how might student housing rights be improved? You know, what's the payoff for a loss of security? And we had so these are our ideas. So students who entered a tenancy because they intended to study at an institution and then failed to be accepted by that institution would be able to leave their tenancy within a short notice period. By the way, that probably happens mainly anyway, that people say, okay, go. Those who leave their studies mid-year could give up their contract with 2 months' notice, right? Because they're only there to be students. And those who sign their contracts well in advance could have a cooling off period. And we were suggesting people could leave their contract with no detriment from May the 1st for the following academic year, or 4 months prior to the contract taking effect. And in our view, those benefits would be of much greater value to students than security of tenure. And we're talking here not about the vast majority of students, which is really where we're coming from. Just to pick up the idea, there have been suggestions, including from the DLUT committee and from some MPs, that a government-approved accreditation scheme could offer exemption for off-street properties, as the PBSA codes will. Well, you know, there are lots of accreditation schemes around the country. There are quite a number. They're on the ANET website, if you Google that. We run some local authority schemes with local authorities in Nottingham, Leeds and Bradford. There are schemes run by Dash at a number of places. Loughborough and Derby spring to mind. So, you know, you could do something about that, but there isn't a national standard for off-street housing, although we did actually develop one of those for accommodation for students some time ago. So it's possible for that kind of code to be developed. The real problems relate to verification, which is much more complicated for smaller landlords than for big buildings. And it would be important to weed out the unscrupulous, because there will be some people who will sign up not meeting those standards at all. And that means that the cost of that is quite expensive, right? Because if you've only got one property, you'd have to verify that. And although you can sample, it gets very complicated when you're dealing with managing agents who are managing very, very different types of accommodation and very different standards. So to be honest, if someone had raised that in 2018, by now you might have had a national accreditation system up and running for off-street properties, but no one did. Other provisions in the bill, and we're on the home straight now, so the last 5 minutes. The most helpful publication I've seen on this is the House of Commons briefing, House of Commons Library briefing on the bill. And that gives some detail and also tells you where detail is missing. So if you haven't come across that, there's the link, and it's a good read. Short-shuttle tenancies in purpose-built student accommodation. There are going to be some grounds changed so that they are out of scope of security, and you'll get a copy of this afterwards, so I won't go through the detail. But landlords are going to be required to include notice in a mandatory written statement that possession might be recovered using new ground 4, which is how the government's proposing doing it. Although I will just say we haven't seen, again, any granular detail on that. So the exact words you've got there is all there is. Rent increases. A landlord can only increase the rent during the fixed term AST by including a rent review clause. That's the current section. In future, you'll only be able to do that annually, and the provisions in the bill would make a service of a Section 13 notice the only way a rent increase could take place, right? So, and I'm not going to bother too much the stuff about unreasonable rent increases and so on, but when you go into that, I'm afraid that's a bit of window dressing, because you have to go to a tribunal, Tier 1, to challenge it. And to be honest, very, very few tenants will do that. So I think that's just a bit of a con. You may find the odd tenant organisation taking a sample case, and then we've got the pets, another headline grabber. So you can have a pet, and the landlord can't really reasonably refuse within 42 days of receiving a written request. There's no let-outs for this for students, by the way, in PBSA or off-street. But as a condition of giving consent, the tenant has to have some pet insurance. So there are lots of problems about what's a pet. There are lots of problems about what's reasonable, and there are lots of issues about what would be reasonable insurance. But very recently, the government have confirmed that where a superior lease forbids pets, that condition would continue. So if you've got a sublease, then by definition, you can't be forced by this act to break your lease. But again, you know, it's a moving story. So it sounds good until you put in the granular detail. We've got a landlord redress scheme, which allows consumers to complain. There's no current legal requirement for that in England. But since 2014, all letting and managing agents have been required to belong to a government-approved redress scheme. At the moment, that's the Property Ombudsman or the Property Redress Scheme. But if you need client money protection, if you're a letting agent, that also requires membership of a redress scheme. So the government's committed to making sure that all tenants have rights to redress. It said they only intend to approve one redress scheme, but it won't quite work out like that, I think. And in theory, the Ombudsman then has powers to put things right. I would just say that if you look at the level of redress on housing, it's very, very low levels of compensation. So it says the government intends to lay regulations as soon as possible after royal assent. So this is a long way down the line to further define the scope of the landlord redress scheme. And they specifically say there may be special arrangements made for niche tenures, and that includes purpose-built student accommodation. So again, a bit of an acceptance that students are a niche tenure. There's going to be a new private rented sector database, which is known as a property portal. And this is all things to all people, by the way. So it helps landlords understand their legal obligations and demonstrate compliance. So it's fascinating how it's going to do that. It provides information to tenants and assists local authorities to target enforcement. And this is about landlords requiring to register themselves and their properties on there. And that's going to be reasonably administratively onerous for a lot of people, and particularly universities are going to be on there, by the way. There's no exemptions. So the regulations will set out how and by whom entries on the database are to be made, require information and documents, impose other requirements, including payment for registering yourself, and allowing an entry to be made when you don't know everything. So when you're halfway through stuff. Information is personal information about the landlord and the dwelling, details of any other person involved in the ownership or management, and evidence relating to property standards. So perhaps gas safety and electrical. I've already said gas safety and electrical installation condition reports. So just in terms of Unipol, we will be providing those certificates to the landlord property portal, and we'll be providing them to the fire authority under the Fire Safety Act, and we'll be providing them to the enforcing authority and the HSE under the Building Safety Act, and we'll be providing them to Leeds City Council and Nottingham City Council under the mandatory and additional and selective licensing regulations. So there we are. So I hope everyone's happy with those 4 or 5 copies of exactly the same document. Right, so you'll forgive my cynicism for that at the moment. And there's certain amounts of time, but adverts for properties will have to include a unique identifier. So that's how it's going to be enforced. And you may have heard from the Local Government Association that they have made it very clear that in order to enforce this act, they will need more staff and funding. And the government said, yes, they're going to make sure that all those resources as required are available. So that's all right then. So something we don't need to bother about. But Local Government Association is very concerned about how enforcement works in this area. So I think the conclusions are, just at the moment, is DLUC are trying to minimise changes to the bill in respect of students whilst accepting some need to treat them differently. They've not explored in any detail how special arrangements may work. And we are coming up to the beginning of the next academic year when it's expected there'll be a number of serious housing shortages around the country for students. And that will be the time to restart lobbying with DLUC as they realise that they might be rightly blamed for those problems. Okay, so that's where we're at. I've overrun by about 7 minutes. But thanks very much. And now we're going to go to the kind of people we've fingered, I think. Let me just stop sharing. There we go. Okay.
Thanks very much, Martin. So we've got a couple of people that we've kind of identified from the delegate list that Claire is going to start to make panelists, so they should start to appear in a moment. We can have a bit of a discussion about some of the issues. I wanted to, while we're waiting for that to happen in the background, we've had a couple of questions that have come through on the Q&A, and we thought we could have a look at some of those while we're waiting for that to work. So one of the questions that's come through is, has there been any discussion on how periodic tenancies would work with joint tenancies? Would one student in the house be able to end the tenancy for all, or does this effectively need to abolish joint tenancies?
Okay,
Martin?
well, I mean, we've looked at that in detail, and the answer is, has there been any discussion in terms of have DLUT responded to any discussion about joint tenancies? The answer is no. They kind of shrug their shoulders. Would one student in the house be able to end the tenancy for all? The answer is a big yes. Right, because it's if one person gives notice, as of now, it ends the whole tenancy. So yes, it's really messy, joint tenancies here. Now, some of us don't like joint tenancies very much anyway, and think you're better off having single tenancies. But, you know, actually, no one's really picked that up as an issue and how it actually works. You've got a couple of questions from Ahmed Hassan. Would it not be a good thing for students to be discouraged for HOs and pushed towards PBSA? Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I wasn't aware that the Renters Reform Bill was a planning exercise. I thought it was about housing standards. So I think it's quite important to keep it on that level. Otherwise, you could say everyone should have a golden door knocker, or, you know, and just say, well, that will stop people in, you know, wasting their money on student housing. The truth is that students are already, you see more and more students renting in PBSA, but the problem you've got is that the growth of PBSA, purpose-built student accommodation, despite what people may think when you look at all the cranes, is really slowing, right? So this summer, there were about 9,000 new bed spaces coming online. And that compares with 4 years ago, pre-COVID, where we were getting, for a decade, over 30,000 extra bed spaces a year. So, and by the way, we're predicting that there's going to be a virtual standstill in 2025-6. I did some figures yesterday, so I could share with you that we are opening a building this year where the build cost per bed space is just below £65,000. If we'd done it a year later, it would have been £90,000. And if we did it today, it would be £105,000, right? And I would say that neither of those two options are viable in terms of the rent levels you'd be looking at. You know, in Leeds, you'd be looking at a weekly rent level at 105,000, well over £250 a week for a room in a shared cluster. And so that's what's really happening. What's really happening is that investors are just saying it doesn't work at the moment. We can't work out what our build costs are. They're very high, and we can't work out what our financing costs are. The other thing is a lot of the money going into PBSA came from investment funds who were very, very happy to get 5.5% from the government by investing in gilts. So at the moment, you get more money from the government than you would for taking a commercial risk. So I think that would be quite a good argument to say, well, you know, okay, we see the decline of off-street housing and students will increasingly live in PBSA. I think that was happening anyway, but that is going to stall a bit. There is the other problem that purpose-built student accommodation is quite a lot more expensive than off-street housing. So there's an affordability issue. Although that gap is narrowing, it varies around the country from between 40 to 20% cheaper, right? And that isn't just because purpose-built operators are charging higher rents and making more money. It's because they are much more expensive buildings. So if you went in our largest building, by the time you get to your front door of your flat, you've spent about 30% of your rent, you know, because you've walked through security fencing, you've walked through the garden, you've come into a big lounge, you've said good morning to the security guy, you've got into a long corridor and a lobby, you've gone upstairs to your flat in a very expensive lift, and then you've walked towards your flat. All of those areas have to be heated, cleaned and serviced, and there's a much higher level of safety provision than it. Now, that compares with a small off-street house, where in some of our houses, people are stood on the pavement when they're opening the door. So they haven't spent a penny until they go through the front door. So that was that. Okay. Dan Lucas asks, any particular thought on issues that might specifically relate to students who are families? Well, one is they wouldn't be out of scope because they're not in an HMO. I suppose one could come up with some bizarre scenario where people have got 2 lodgers or whatever, and they'd then be an HMO. But I think family housing is a really fraught area. Most universities don't provide any housing directly for families. I don't think there is any impact, Dan, to be honest, on them. I think they're just students with families are just entering the normal housing market. I suppose the particular issue is that those students are often from Nigeria and India, who are looking to pay often unrealistic sums. I mean, around £400 to £500 a month. They probably can pay between £600 to £800, but they are definitely at the budget end of the market. But I don't think there are any real impacts, because I don't think we're going to see too many HMOs, especially 5 and above, that move back into family housing. I don't think that will happen as a result of this. Victoria.
Okay, right. Well, thanks, Martin, and thanks for those questions that have been sent in. We've got some of the delegates who we've made into panelists, and we have, I suppose, some questions, and it'd be really interesting to see if any of you have any particular thoughts about any of what Martin said, or any of the impacts of the bill in your particular area. I'm going to start and ask Richard Napier, actually. Richard, if you could briefly introduce where you're from and what your interest is in this. And I don't know if there's anything that you want to add, or any points that you want to touch on.
Sure, yeah. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm one of the directors of Sugar House Properties in Leeds, so we have the bulk of our business is student accommodation. So obviously this is very pertinent to us. I've not really got any good news to add to anything, I don't think. It's all one of these sort of classic government well-intentioned things that ends up in a bit of a mess for other areas, such as student market, which hasn't really been considered. I think what was interesting, a couple of weeks ago, we were on a panel with the NRLA, who are obviously campaigning quite actively on this, particularly with they've kind of, I think they're losing a lot of the battles, but the student one was one they thought they might be able to sort of make some leeway with. Interestingly, they've kind of gone away now from the we think we're trying to push for an exemption for student tenancies. That seems to be, in their opinion, sort of dead in the water, which probably ties into similar from what Martin was saying, and they're now sort of pushing for some sort of grounds for possession from the landlord at the end, but to be clear, that would not involve a 12-month student contract moving forward. So that's something that they, from sort of meeting with government ministers, they've pretty much kind of given up on that, which I think probably not a lot of landlords and agents are aware of. I think there's a lot of people still thinking, well, it'll either be in or it won't be in, and I think it's becoming much clearer that that's not going to be the case. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be the problem with all this stuff is what happens at the end of it is the tenants tend to suffer, so it'll push rents up. Will be probably the main consequence in the big cities like Leeds, where there's a big student demand and the markets are quite nicely sort of poised. There'll be a bit of withdrawal of supply, rents will go up, and the market will probably sort itself out. But at the end of the day, that's not great for the student tenants. That you've got cities like Huddersfield and places like that where they're really going to struggle with the impact of this, because they're struggling for sort of finding enough student accommodation and numbers and stuff anyway. And there's things like bills. I mean, all our tenancies are 12-month bills inclusive. So, we sign agreements and we price stuff up based on, sort of aggregates of 12 months of the fee. So how that works in terms of managing that, where you've got people flitting in between, is another challenge for us to think about. The president in Scotland shows that it's pretty much a disaster, which isn't great, and I think it's good there's been lots of stuff in the press about that and other cities where there's huge student accommodation shortages, but it doesn't seem to be quite filtering through as we hoped it would. And yeah, I think the tenants moving between tenancy is something that doesn't seem to be the impact of that doesn't really seem to be recognised. So we have, I'd say, a third of our houses through an academic year will have a reassignment in place in some capacity. And there's two areas to that. There's one, people dropping out of university, which happens. I mean, I know the Leeds Beckett's dropout rate wasn't great. I think it's got a little bit better. But if you look at the percentages, that's a lot of students. Leeds Uni as well, but not so much. And then you've got loads of stuff between tenancies. So we get loads of students moving between properties. Now, how that would work in practice would be a bit of a nightmare. And does that, one tenant falls out with the housemates, wants to leave? Does that create issues within the tenancy with them pressuring them to stay or not? So there's all sorts of kind of social aspects and inter-tenant issues there as well. But I think it's underestimated how many tenants do switch between properties through the year for personal reasons primarily. And there's a real challenge around sort of the welfare of the tenants in regards to that being restricted or creating a situation where other tenants are essentially pressurising people to make decisions for the group and not being able to just reassign people onto the same sort of 12-month tenancy, etc. So there's all sorts of things to sort of put in the wash. The market will sort itself out. In some capacity, rents will go up. I think Leeds will be okay, but it's just creating a load of problems that unfortunately are going to be quite challenging. Obviously, the timescales that just keep dragging out. So whether that's going to be anytime soon, probably not. But yeah, so nothing particularly positive to add really. But
it's I think there's going to be a lot of practical things to figure out and different ways of doing things. Thank you, Richard. That's really useful. I wanted to bring in Cooper Healy actually from Manchester Student Homes and see whether you've got any thoughts on this, Cooper, or kind of what you reflect on all of it.
Yeah, thanks very much for asking me to be on the panel, and thanks as always to Martin and to Unipol for a wonderful presentation and some real food for thought. From a Manchester position, and I should, I guess, now start talking in a GM, a Greater Manchester position, because everything's kind of GM focused these days. We have 6 or 7 HEIs in that region. All feeding into a really large student capacity for the city and for the region, around about 120,000 students. So it's no small indicator, and I think we're all aware perhaps of the headlines of the last couple of years where we have run out of capacity in the city for students, and I have to add for other areas of private rented sector. It's not just students that were unable to be housed in our city. And both of the 2 Manchester institutions were going out and taking rooms, Liverpool, Huddersfield, Preston, etc. And that's clearly not where we want to be. The City Council in Manchester has had an effective moratorium on any PBSA build for the last few years, and there's been some recent planning decisions that have been overturned in terms of council's planning strategy, and a number of papers that have been written by both the City Council and from external consultants to try to get a handle on what the situation is, where there might be further capacity to build, to develop, where there are planning permissions, where there have been pre-planning discussions, where there might be land, either council owned or university owned, that would be fit for development. And I think those discussions are still ongoing, but linking in with what has been said today on the presentation, that will just produce, because of the cost of land and the cost of building, it's going to produce highly wonderful, highly expensive, hermetically sealed studio apartments that only a certain section of the student body will be able to afford. And certainly the University of Manchester and its international student numbers and the growth of international student numbers will be where that will fit. So in terms of other things that Martin's picked up on, additional accreditation, Andy Burnham is currently running a GM Good Landlords Charter that I think he wants to introduce to the region by the end of this year. I've been asked to sit on the working group with that, but it's a one size fits all across the entire sector. It's another level of accreditation that people may or may not have to pay for, may or may not feel obliged to do, particularly when there are already really decent, well-established, long-running accreditation schemes at Manchester Student Homes in the city, and perhaps no need to replicate that on a GM level. So something to watch out for. That, and whilst, you know, obviously we welcome all forms of accreditation and the ability to try to raise standards in the private sector, when are there too many? For a number of years, we've been speaking to our landlords. We speak to them very closely, and there is real concern amongst the HMO landlord market around this bill. And we've had many threats from people that, you know, they're coming out of the sector. City Council will always announce that there has been a shrinking of HMOs in the Fallowfield and Withington areas and a move towards the city centre with the build of additional PRS blocks that have perhaps replaced some of the PBSA. And I think the recent conversation was around 18 million last year in so-called lost revenue for council tax. It isn't our experience at Manchester Student Homes that the HMO market is necessarily shrinking, but certainly it's stymied. We have an article for planning direction across the city, and that is certainly not helping people convert between C3 and C4 class use. So really, really difficult for that very, very tight market already. Manchester Student Homes, on behalf of the two universities, supported the NRLA in their letter a few months ago to government with regards to asking them to exempt HMO from the bill in the same way that PBSA does. But as colleague Richard just said, it looks like, you know, they've stopped banging on that door so much and are now looking at really where the grounds for possession are. And then I suppose finally, again, just as we, you know, I think we have to pay attention to the impact and effect on student mental health, well-being, security around this. I suspect that that's going to be extremely difficult going forward with an unsure sector and lack of security. And if the bill goes ahead in its current format and the 2-month notice period is in, it is going to mean that landlords are not going to be able to let their properties or advertise to let their properties until May. Which is, you know, heading right into examination time and just adds an additional complication for students in terms of what they should be doing and concentrating on at that time of year. I think Manchester's next PBSA development to deliver any bed spaces is not going to happen until at least 2024. And so, you know, I'm just back from holiday and I'm really looking forward to A-level results coming out. So we shall see where that market takes us. I hope that's okay in terms of a GM roundup.
No, that's really useful. Thanks, Cooper. It's really, really interesting points. And it looks, I just want to say, it looks like I think we're going to run over slightly and probably do another 10 minutes. So I think it's worthwhile hearing a bit more from some of the other panelists and dealing with this. Martin, were you going to say something just then?
No, I was, other than perhaps going on to Irving, actually.
Irving?
Can you hear me now? Yeah?
Can, yeah.
I just want to make sure these headphones are working, that's all. Right, well, first off, thanks for inviting me on. It's good to be here and I appreciate that. So my observation, so I suppose I've got two things really. One is generally, and then one is the market we operate in. So we specifically operate in Leicester, which is it's been a difficult market over the last few years. I mean, I'll echo some of the stuff that I think Richard said about Leeds. I think my feeling is that there will be certain cities across the country that have got very high demand, like Leeds, like Nottingham, like Durham in particular, where I think the overall impact of this will be annoying and administratively burdensome and so on and so forth. But I think that the end result will probably just be that the rents will go up, because that's always what happens whenever you impose costs on anybody. So I suspect the rents will go up. But overall, in the scheme of life to the operators, I'm thinking of, say, Unipol here or Sugar House or what have you, I suspect that life will roll on. I think it will be much more difficult in difficult markets. Certainly, echoing what Cooper just said, I'm always a bit nervous about these anecdotal statements, but we are definitely seeing people that are leaving this market. There's no two ways about it. We are seeing people weekly asking us, do we want to buy their properties, or is anybody else available? There is stuff that is just coming on the market all the time. And I think that this is just the icing on the cake. I mean, look, if you're going to ask anybody to feel sympathetic for landlords, you're gonna find the world's tiniest violin, right? But certainly there's a culmination of the tax changes that we had a few years ago, the increasing regulation. You've got Article 4, you've got local licensing that's coming in, and now this on top of it, and it's just a bit of a battering ram, I think, in the end. So I think that difficult markets will probably become more difficult. You will get smaller landlords leave. That's going to be good news if you're a PBSA operator, quite likely, because those difficult markets will now suck up more of there'll be less choice and there'll be more, okay, we'll end up in PBSA. Inevitably, that's going to mean the costs are going to go up, because it just will. So I think that's going to be some of the unintended consequences. One of the things, I mean, unless Martin can tell me differently, I think one of the things that hasn't been said is that NUS are quite strongly petitioning for this and saying what a good idea it is. I mean, the blind irony that they imposed this in Scotland and the market imploded, and now NUS Scotland said this year, I think it was, how terrible it was that there was no student accommodation is quite strange, really. But there you are. I think that's going to be difficult. What else do I think will be difficult? I think the monthly, and my understanding is, unless somebody can tell me, I know what Martin said, that it's a bit up for conjecture, but I mean, my understanding is you're going to be looking at monthly rent payments. I think inevitably that's going to increase cost. You're going to end up with more debt, probably the operators will. So I think that's going to be quite difficult and tricky. Yeah, I mean, it's not a very sunny outlook, is it really? As I say, I think if you're in a city with a good supply demand balance, or even tipped in your favour, I think that overall this will be annoying and difficult. If you're not, I'm talking from an operator, obviously. I don't think it's going to be fatal. I think it will be more difficult in some of the more marginal cities. And what will happen is you'll have a decline of this accommodation. It will move to other sectors, or potentially go back to residential. That's a bit less likely. And that what you'll end up with, you'll just end up with less choice and more cost.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think it's something that universities might want to think about. How this could affect accommodation supply over the next few years as an emerging risk as well, for them to consider at where students are going to live if they're dependent on students coming into the city to study, which most universities are. So.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. Daniel Cape, welcome Sheffield. Is there anything you want to add?
I just think that the recognition of unintended consequences is quite ironic, really, because we're all sat here as experts who are involved in a consultation. And a lot of what's actually touted, as Martin said, it feels like it's made to grab headlines. Seems a common theme in current government that we will push legislation that's already covered elsewhere. So when we talk about things like homes fit for human habitation, we're talking about raising standards again. Does that mean the legislation's failed? We have the selective licensing schemes. Does that mean they failed, or do we need another headline piece of legislation? There's also things like we talked about planning. Cooper mentioned the moratorium in Manchester. We've just entered that period now after a glut of investment in the city. We had the council carry out a market survey in 2001 with Cushman. We saw a glut of 12,000 bed spaces introduced since 2015 in Sheffield, so 12,300, which is massive for a market. And then we look at application numbers across the city. Whilst the University of Sheffield has increased their numbers, as is common across a number of post-92s, applications potentially down. There's a little bit of realignment across those kind of cities. And I think affordability, we always come back to affordability and student welfare. As Irving said, when things like this come in, costs will always go up. And when we factor in other elements, such as cities like York, where there's already not enough accommodation, there's more potentially interesting opportunities in Airbnb for tourism and travel. Which way would you go? Do you remove the risk? And I guess it's about risk management and ultimately who pays it. And again, as Irving said, we're talking about it's an attack on landlords because legislation after legislation. We've not mentioned that, well, in the past 6 minutes, interest rates have gone up again, which will no doubt feed through to renters. You're going to have to factor in potential breaks, and where does that come in? So if you've got a 2-month notice period, who pays for that? And then we've also got the green bill. We don't really know what's happening with the green bill. We're going to have, if landlords have to up properties to a C, where's going to be the exemption point? Is it going to be £3,000? Is it going to be £10,000? Is that legislation coming in? And again, it's the unforeseen stuff that Richard touched on. So students want high-speed internet, usually on a 12-month contract. Students will want Virgin Media or they'll want Sky, again on a 12, 18-month contract. If we go down that route, then you're entering financial issues again for students, all of which are unintended consequences, but completely foreseeable. And it's a similar theme for away from students as well. And stock as well, one size fits all across all. Like if we take Leeds has got a big back-to-back market with 2 beds. We've got predominantly 4 beds in our city. So again, they're very easy converted to, they're very easy to convert to family lets. And then the last thing I was going to touch on was council tax. Councils struggle with this anyway. We've recently had a property prohibited. I got a raft of students who aren't actually students, but they're exempt from council tax. It's very difficult to accurately report on that. And Sheffield City Council have been trying to recruit housing officers for the best part of 2 years, just generally struggling, citing a lack of qualified staff coming through. So whilst it's good that the government acknowledged that the staff and funding are required, you've got to go back to actual source. Whilst there is a willingness to recruit, it's what can you actually recruit? And then we're going a similar way to doctors and nurses. It's completely different, but environmental health is not your natural choice for an 18-year-old to want to go to university to study. So where do these people actually come from, these skilled individuals, to enforce what effectively is a headline grabbing piece of legislation?
Thank you very much, Danny. That's really, really interesting. I'm going to move over to Jake Ross from Liverpool John Moores and see if there's anything that you'd like to add, Jake, and then we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes' time.
Thank you, Victoria. Martin, the presentation was great, and thank you to the panelists as well. Some excellent points there, no more so than discussing about where this government enjoys headline grabbing, and I think we'll park that there instead of have a look at the state of play at the minute. No, in Liverpool, this is not something that's going to hit us. We don't think straight away. Liverpool John Moores University just does PBSA. We don't own any. We have approved accommodation providers, and we're part of, similar to Cooper, Liverpool Student Homes. As how that works, it's exactly the same setup. And one of the things that just comes onto our radar recently is this year we have seen a lot more issues in private landlord accommodation and HMO that then fall to in our accommodation office doorstep. We've also seen, I think one of the panelists touched on earlier, is people contacting us trying to sell their HMO to ourselves. It's like, it's not our interest or our area. That squeeze is starting to happen before this then comes in. But with regards to, there's roughly 28,000 bed spaces in the city. There's nothing in the pipeline that's going to help us along moving forward in the city that's got in excess of 70,000 students and is growing year on year, especially with 5 institutions who just are out there to try and get more postgraduates, more anything than just any type of student to come in with the current market and the state of play. But one of the things that stood out recently is had myself and Ed, who's head of accommodation here, LJ and me, scratching our heads, is that of the 75% of our registered PBSA that is out there, they report back that they've only got 12% capacity now, which is insane when you think that and this was back in, I think, June. So you still have clearing to come along. You still have people who are just going to have last minute choices. We don't really understand if this is going to really squeeze the HMO market. These students don't have a place to filter into. Another one the panelists mentioned earlier about is this going to highlight failures in previous policy and previous acts and stuff. Most definitely, it's one that is going to squeeze somewhere without letting something else go. A recent comment from a business lead in Liverpool City Centre saying that he's starting to reevaluate his investment in student accommodation for the reason that no one seems to be backing him. and no one seems to be helping him come along and build new PBSA to plug that gap in that market. And it is something that we're investigating to try and put our weight and our backing behind that as a university, as an institution, encourage other institutions to do similar, because a homeless student's useless to a university in the most possible way. They can't study, they can't focus on their study, they have greater money advice concerns. And one of the things, oh, my Siri's just kicking in. One of the things that I think the Renters Reform Bill worries ourselves from a student advice and wellbeing point is the monthly payment part, because we have all of our approved accommodations offer termly payments. It's easy to manage money that way. It falls into line with their loan payments. If you're asking them to study on top of then deciding at the end of every month that they've got a bill to pay, it's not going to work. It's not very kind on the student or anyone for that matter, for the people that are either the landlord's chasing the rent or the student that's trying to pay the rent. So there's a lot to really think and consider, and don't get me wrong, do I think it's a bit deaf to reality at times? Yeah, and I'm glad that Martin's and everybody that's taken part in trying to lobby this and get it just into line. It's one of those where personally I think it's the right idea. Is it executed right? No. It doesn't need more thinking. Yeah, most definitely. It doesn't need to be rushed along. So yeah, we're looking on with very interested eyes, and most definitely seeing the impact that's having already on our approved accommodations and those landlords that are signed up already. And all being well, it will pull into line. But yeah, we've got the big hurdle of a general election next year to get over. So we'll wait and see what happens from there onwards.
Thank you. Thanks, Jake. That's really helpful. Those are some really good thoughtful comments as well. Thank you to everybody that was willing to be a panelist at quite short notice. We really appreciate it, because you've all added something interesting and something that we hadn't already discussed as part of the presentation. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand over to Martin, but before to kind of wrap up, but before I do so, I just wanted to say thank you for everybody that's taken part. Unipol is ramping up its training again next year, and we've got a whole host of new events that are going to start to appear on the websites very soon. So do take a look at that. We're also running the accommodation cost survey, a mini version of it this year, because of the cost of living issues that students are facing. We wanted to rerun the accommodation cost survey to try and capture what's happening to rent in PBSA. We're just doing it across 10 cities. It's a bit of a smaller version of it, so we can do it more quickly. If you can take part in that and you're in one of the cities that's on the list, we'll circulate details after this. If you could take part, we would really appreciate it, because we think now is the time to have some good data about what the real cost of living in purpose-built student accommodation is, particularly before the general election, when how student maintenance is funded will be a topic. So if you can take part, that would be fantastic. I'm going to hand over to Martin, who might have some final things that he wants to say, and then we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Okay, well, thanks so much for that. And it was good. The panel were a good cross-section, actually. So we're really pleased with what you said. I mean, Richard went on about just some of the detailed management of this, which I think is really quite messy. Cooper speaking from a city with a serious housing shortage, and also a serious student housing shortage. So I should say we're about to bring out our list of where we think there are going to be shortages this year. I could just say that Liverpool's on the amber section of that list. But it's interesting that we're getting overlapping markets. So people have mentioned students in Huddersfield, for example. Well, actually, Huddersfield's taking students from Bradford, Leeds, and Manchester, and it's beginning to develop its own housing shortage. So we're beginning to see those kind of dynamic linkages. And of course, you said a Greater Manchester, but it's also a problem for Salford, because what the hell, it's only up the road, isn't it? So it's all one big housing market. But always very interesting to know what Irving thinks about Leicester. I for what it's worth, think the market's improving a bit in Leicester. So Leicester's been doing a little bit better on intake, and I think Sheffield is beginning to fill out a bit after a period of quite serious surplus. So you're beginning to see those surpluses willow down a bit, really, and as the Russell Group cut back on their intakes for home undergraduates, you'll see kind of second choice institutions I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I think it's a kind of waterfall effect. But Leicester did, for the first time, did quite a bit better, Leicester University last year. And they should have done, because they should be capturing all those people who are being turned away from King's and Imperial or whatever. They're going to look for a university of some quality. Yeah, and Liverpool, which had a huge surplus, and it's virtually over. You know, and I mean, Ed, who couldn't be with us today, but you know, said a couple of years ago, you know, we could do with another couple of thousand bed spaces because they won't be ready for 3 to 4 years. And, you know, everyone thinks we're in massive surplus, but that is definitely over. So I think we've got a very kind of dynamic but effective, I mean, just to reflect, institutions have taken 272,000 additional international students since 2019. And they are all poured into those housing markets. They haven't all poured into PBSA. And the other piece of research we're doing is to work out, in some cases, where the hell they've gone, because they seem to have melted away. And a lot of January intakes seem to have just melted away. So we know there's a lot of commuting, there's a lot of sofa surfing. So you know, we're beginning to see all the normal facets of a serious housing shortage crop up. I'm sorry we don't agree with NUS on this, but I think it's really simple for us. And the calculation we're making is, do we think security is worth what it will cost? And I think the bottom line is we don't. We'd like to see a few other things come in, but we don't really think that's a good deal. People will end up spending more money for more administrative complexity, and you know, I think that's a bit of an issue. So that's the calculation that we're making. I mean, the other thing I would kind of just think about is, why is this government so keen on being nice to students in housing? You know, when they've done such a sterling job on maintenance loans and courses and funding institutions, you know. So I think that we don't want things to get complicated and we're just trying to get a piece of legislation on the books. You know, it's really rough and ready stuff, isn't it? You know, that's what I actually think. I mean, I think it's, the educational lobby is a bit of a pain, frankly, because they're saying something which might be true and it's all a bit complicated. So would you all go away? Anyway, there we go. We're not going away, and we will definitely, I'm afraid, be making the link between student housing shortages and this particular piece of legislation. And as we explained to the bill manager, we want this to be your fault. So, you know, it's a political response to a political piece of legislation. So, however, I'll say goodbye. Have a great summer. And, you know, I know most people on this call will be working really hard to make sure that students get the best experience. And in general, I think you all succeed. Every year, I'm constantly amazed by how the system works. But it's really complicated and it's really intensive. And, you know, someone should say, even though if you're a landlord, you know, it is in fact working quite well. So, you know, we should reflect that for certainly the people on this call. Okay, so we'll see you again sometime. We might do another event over the summer based on shortages and what people are saying. We've already had quite a lot of media interest in what's going to happen, and I wish you all the best. And the 78 people who remain all get a gold star for being 20 minutes late. Okay, lovely to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Take care. See you again soon. Bye.